It was just another slow morning at the diner. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air, and the clatter of plates filled the silence between tired customers. Behind the counter stood her, a waitress who had been working double shifts, just to keep the lights on at home. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, she wasn't powerful, but she had something many others lacked: a heart full of kindness. So when she noticed a man digging through his pockets, realizing he didn't have enough money to pay for his coffee, she didn't hesitate. She reached into her own tip jar, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, it's on me." Little did she know that single act of generosity would change her life forever, because the man sitting at that booth wasn't just another customer. Hours later, he would slip her a folded piece of paper, a note that would stop her in her tracks and leave the entire diner in stunned silence. What could be written inside? And how could one free cup of coffee rewrite the destiny of a woman who had almost given up hope? The diner sat at the corner of a quiet street in a town that most people simply drove through without stopping. Its neon sign flickered between open and opaque, the light buzzing faintly against the cracked brick walls. For most, it was just another greasy spoon, chipped mugs, red leather booths with stuffing poking through the seams, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. But for those who stopped by, it was a place where lives brushed together, if only for a moment. And behind the counter, pouring cup after cup of coffee that never seemed strong enough, was Sarah Miller. Sarah had worked here for years, though, not because she loved it. She hadn't dreamed of being a waitress. As a child, she wanted to be a teacher, maybe even a writer. But life had a way of redirecting dreams, often without asking permission. When her mother got sick, Sarah left college to take care of her. When her mother passed, the debt from medical bills buried her so deep she could barely breathe. And when her husband walked out a year later, leaving her with a young daughter and an apartment she could hardly afford, the diner became her only lifeline. Every morning before sunrise, she tied her apron strings tight, tucked her hair into a messy bun, and stepped behind the counter with a smile that rarely reached her eyes. She was friendly, attentive, and quick, the kind of waitress who remembered how you liked your eggs and always topped off your coffee before you could ask. But behind her polite warmth lived exhaustion. Her hands cracked from dish soap, her feet ached from hours of walking, and every night, when she counted her tips, the numbers never seemed to add up to enough. Still, Sarah wasn't bitter. She couldn't afford to be. Her daughter Emily was the light of her life, and she refused to let despair steal the small joys they shared. Bedtime stories, laughter over burnt pancakes, whispered dreams about someday. Someday they'd have a house with a backyard. Someday Emily would get to go to the art classes she begged for. Someday Sarah would breathe without feeling like the world was crushing her chest. But for now, someday felt like a fantasy. The diner had regulars, most of them truckers passing through or retirees who came for the cheap coffee and a little conversation. There were businessmen in wrinkled suits who rushed in before meetings, families trying to save money on breakfast, and sometimes college kids who treated the booths like their study hall. Sarah knew them all by name. She knew their habits, their moods, their favorite orders. She often joked that she was less of a waitress and more of a therapist with a coffee pot. And then there were strangers. Strangers who slipped in quietly, ordered a single cup of coffee, and stared out the window like the world had forgotten them. Sarah had a soft spot for those people. She recognized the look, tired, worn down, alone. It was the same look she saw in the mirror most mornings. That's why she noticed him right away. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where time felt heavy, and the rain tapped against the windows in a slow rhythm. A man walked in, his clothes neat but understated. He wasn't flashy, didn't demand attention, and yet something about him carried a quiet weight. He slid into a booth by the window, opened a leather notebook, and tapped a pen against the page without writing a word. When Sarah came by, he ordered just a black coffee. No food, no small talk, just coffee. She brought it to him with a smile, trying not to notice the sharpness in his eyes. Observant, calculating, almost as if he saw more than what was in front of him. An hour later, Sarah passed by again and noticed him patting his jacket pockets, then his pants, his expression tightening. She paused at a distance, not wanting to intrude, but she saw it clearly. He didn't have his wallet. Sarah had seen this scene before, embarrassed customers, fumbling through excuses, trying to figure out how to get out of paying for a $2 cup of coffee. Most waitresses would have rolled their eyes, maybe called out the dishonesty. But Sarah? She saw the tension in his face, the faint flush of shame, and something inside her softened. Without a second thought, she leaned in with a kind smile and said quietly, "Don't worry about it. This one's on me." The man froze, his eyes flicking up to hers in surprise. For a split second, his gaze softened, almost like he wasn't used to people doing things for him. Then, with a polite nod, he returned to his notebook. Sarah didn't think much of it. To her, it was just a cup of coffee, maybe $2 out of her tips. She had covered worse. She had once paid for a young mother's pancakes when her card declined. She had slipped sandwiches into paper bags for homeless men who wandered in from the rain. To Sarah, kindness was never wasted, even if it cost her something. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man sitting in that booth was no ordinary customer. He wasn't broke. He wasn't stranded. He wasn't another face passing through town. He was Daniel Ashford, a billionaire CEO known for his ruthless business strategies and near-invisible public life. But in this moment, in this unassuming diner, he wasn't playing the role of billionaire. He was just a man, sitting alone, carrying a weight that money couldn't fix. And Sarah's small act of generosity, the kind she thought would go unnoticed, had just drawn his full attention. Hours later, after most of the morning crowd had cleared, Daniel scribbled something on a piece of paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it under his coffee cup before walking out the door. Sarah found it minutes later, wiping down the table. At first, she thought it was just a napkin, but when she unfolded the paper and saw the words written inside, her hands trembled. Her world and Emily's future were about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Sarah stood by the booth, the folded piece of paper trembling in her hands. She unfolded it slowly, expecting maybe a simple thank you or even an apology for forgetting his wallet. Instead, what she saw left her frozen. The note was written in sharp, deliberate handwriting. Sometimes the smallest kindness changes everything. Meet me here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. D.A. Her first instinct was confusion. Who left notes like this? And what did he mean by changes everything? She flipped the paper over, searching for more, but there was nothing. Just initials. D.A. She didn't recognize them, but something about the way they were written carried weight, as though she should. For the rest of her shift, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The other waitresses teased her lightly, assuming it was a flirtatious message. One joked that maybe he was a poet, another said maybe he was just lonely. But Sarah didn't feel flattered. She felt unsettled, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that made her pulse race. That night, when she tucked Emily into bed, the note sat on her nightstand like a secret too heavy to ignore. Her daughter asked what was wrong, and Sarah forced a smile, saying she was just tired. But her mind kept drifting back to those words. Changes everything. She debated whether to show up. What if it was nothing? What if it was just some stranger messing with her? And yet, what if it wasn't? By morning, her curiosity had won. At 8:59 a.m., Sarah wiped her hands nervously on her apron as the diner door creaked open. The man from yesterday stepped in, wearing the same understated clothes, dark slacks, a plain button-down, and a coat that looked far too expensive to belong in this place. He carried himself with quiet authority, yet when his eyes met hers, there was an unexpected warmth. He slid into the same booth. Sarah brought him coffee, her heart pounding, and placed it in front of him. "You left this," she said softly, sliding the note back across the table. Instead of denying it, he smiled faintly. "I did." Then, almost as if rehearsed, he pushed a small envelope toward her. Sarah blinked. "What's this?" "Open it when you're alone," he said, his voice calm but firm, "and don't refuse it until you've read it." Before she could protest, another customer called for her, and by the time she returned, the man was gone. The envelope sat where he'd been. Her hands shook as she tucked it into her apron pocket, waiting until her shift ended to look. Hours. Later, in the quiet of her apartment, she tore it open. Inside was a check, not for $20 or $50, but for $10,000. The crowd erupted in hushed murmurs. Some customers looked ashamed, others astonished. A few even clapped softly, as though witnessing something they didn't fully understand, but couldn't ignore. Harold, red-faced and humiliated, muttered something under his breath and stormed out, the other board members trailing behind him. When the door slammed shut, the diner seemed to exhale. But Sarah remained frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel turned back to her, his eyes searching hers. "You don't have to take it," he said quietly. "But know this, one act of kindness doesn't just change a day. It changes a life. And sometimes, it changes more than that." Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at the envelope. She wanted to speak, to tell him she didn't need his money, that all she wanted was for the noise and judgment to stop. But another part of her, the part that remembered Emily's tears, her sketches on cheap paper, her dreams too big for their small life, knew this moment was bigger than pride. This wasn't about what people thought. It was about what came next. And as the crowd around them slowly returned to their meals, pretending life was normal again, Sarah realized hers would never be the same. The diner never felt the same after that day. For weeks, people talked about it. The morning a billionaire stood up in a small-town cafe and defended a waitress like she was the most important person in the room. Some gossiped with admiration, others with envy. But for Sarah, the echoes of that moment lived differently inside her. She replayed Daniel's words in her mind at night, not because of the crowd or the drama, but because of the conviction in his voice. He didn't hesitate. He said, "I mattered." The envelope sat untouched on her kitchen counter for 3 days. Emily eyed it curiously, but Sarah avoided it, terrified of what it might mean. Money could solve problems, yes, but it could also create new ones. What if people whispered even more? What if Emily grew up believing her mother couldn't stand on her own without someone else's help? Yet one evening, as Sarah folded laundry and watched Emily coloring at the kitchen table, she noticed the stub of her daughter's pencil, worn down to the nub, the eraser chewed away. Emily had drawn a picture of a library, shelves towering over her tiny figure. At the top, in messy handwriting, she had scrawled, "My dream." Sarah's chest tightened. Dreams required resources she could never provide on her own. That night, with trembling hands, she finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single check. But it wasn't the number that made her gasp. It was the note written in Daniel's precise handwriting. For Emily. Build her future the way she builds. Her dreams. You gave without asking. Let this be my way of giving back. Tears blurred her vision. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was respect. Acknowledgement of what she had done and what Emily deserved. The weeks that followed tested Sarah's courage. People still whispered, but their tone had changed. Some were curious, some supportive, some jealous. Yet Sarah carried herself differently now. She no longer shrank beneath the weight of judgment. She stood taller, anchored by the knowledge that kindness, once given freely, had the power to ripple further than she ever imagined. Daniel didn't disappear after the confrontation. He continued coming to the diner, though less frequently, respecting Sarah's space. Their conversations remained simple. Books, life, the little details that made days bearable. But between them grew something deeper, a quiet trust, built not on wealth or power, but on the rarest thing Sarah had ever known: mutual respect. Emily, meanwhile, flourished. With Daniel's support, Sarah was able to enroll her daughter in better classes, buy her the art supplies she had always longed for, and watch her confidence bloom. The little girl who once feared being different now proudly shared her drawings at school, even winning a local competition that gave her the chance to display her work in the town library. For Sarah, it wasn't just about the money. It was about possibility. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't weighed down by fear of bills, fear of judgment, fear of never being enough. Months later, the diner buzzed with unusual energy once again. Sarah, now manager after her boss recognized her dedication, worked with ease and grace, balancing trays and smiles. She didn't notice at first when the cameras returned. Not sneaky cell phones this time, but professional crews. Daniel had chosen this very diner, their diner, to host a press announcement. He could have rented a ballroom, flown to New York, or chosen a glitzy rooftop, but instead he stood in the same booth where Sarah had once slid a cup of coffee to a stranger in need. The room hushed as he began to speak. "Months ago," Daniel said, his voice steady, "a woman here reminded me of something I had forgotten, that worth isn't measured by wealth, but by character. That a single act of kindness can alter the course of a life, sometimes more than any fortune ever could." The cameras swung toward Sarah, who flushed but did not look away this time. She no longer felt like prey to whispers. She felt like part of the story. Daniel announced a new foundation dedicated to funding education for underprivileged children, named after his late mother. But then he added something no one expected. "And the inspiration for this foundation," he said, looking directly at Sarah and Emily, "is a waitress who chose to see a man in need, not a billionaire in disguise." The room erupted in applause. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as Emily clutched her hand, beaming with pride. For once, Sarah wasn't embarrassed by the attention. She wasn't defined by the whispers. She was defined by the truth. She had mattered. Years later, Emily would tell the story differently. She would talk about the day her mother taught her that kindness matters, even when no one is watching. She would tell how a cup of coffee became a lifeline, not just for a man with billions, but for a little girl with dreams too big for their small life. Sarah's legacy wasn't in the money she received or the foundation that bore fruit. It was in the ripple effect of a single act of compassion. It was in every child whose education was funded, every dream nurtured, every door opened because a woman chose to give when she had little to spare. And though Daniel remained part of their lives, sometimes at dinners, sometimes at Emily's art shows, the story was never about him. It was about her, about the courage to see another human being, stripped of titles and wealth, and to say, simply, "I can help." In the end, Sarah realized something she wished she had known all along. It isn't the size of what you give that matters. It's the heart behind it, and sometimes the smallest kindness changes the world in ways you never expect. Her knees buckled and she sank onto the couch. This couldn't be real. Her first thought was that it was a scam. Her second was that maybe it was a mistake. But clipped to the check was another note. "For your daughter. Education is the only thing no one can take from you. Use this well. If you want to know more, meet me again tomorrow." Sarah pressed the paper to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. No one had ever done something like this for her. She thought about Emily, about the art classes she had begged for, about the possibility of saving for college. $10,000. Could clear some debt, fix the car that broke down every other week, buy time she desperately needed. But why her? Why this man? The following day, against every instinct telling her to be cautious, Sarah returned to the booth at 9 a.m. The man was already there, sipping coffee, his notebook open again. "I can't accept this," she blurted, sliding the envelope back to him. He studied her carefully. "You already did." "I don't understand. Why me?" He leaned back, folding his hands. "Because you didn't hesitate to help me when you thought I had nothing." That's rare. His words stunned her. She wanted to argue, to say it was just coffee, just $2. But deep down, she knew what he meant. Most people looked the other way. She had chosen not to. Finally, he introduced himself. "My name is Daniel Ashford." The name meant nothing to her at first, but later, when she Googled him on her cracked phone screen, her jaw nearly dropped. He wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, with a net worth so staggering it made her head spin. Over the next few weeks, Daniel continued to stop by the diner, always at the same booth, always at the same time. At first, Sarah assumed he wanted company, but slowly she realized he was studying her, asking subtle questions about her life, her daughter, her struggles. He never pried, but he listened. And in return, he shared fragments of his own life, carefully measured, but enough to reveal he was lonelier than anyone would expect a billionaire to be. Sarah felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to keep her distance, to protect herself from whatever game this might be. But another part, the part that remembered the weight of that check in her hands, couldn't deny the possibility that he was genuine. Then, one evening, Sarah returned home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, sketching on cheap printer paper. The drawings were incredible, vivid, detailed, full of life. Sarah's heart swelled with pride, but broke at the same time. Emily deserved better tools, better opportunities. And suddenly, Sarah thought of Daniel's words. "Education is the only thing no one can take from you." She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't trying to buy her off. Maybe he was giving her and Emily something she had never been offered, a chance. But not everyone saw it that way. Word spread quickly in the small town. Customers whispered about the mystery man meeting Sarah every morning. The other waitresses made cruel jokes, calling her a gold digger, saying she must have snagged herself a sugar daddy. Sarah tried to brush it off, but the looks followed her everywhere. Suspicion, envy, judgment. Even her manager pulled her aside one day. "You'd better be careful, Sarah. Men like that don't hang around women like us for no reason." Words cut deep. For the first time, Sarah questioned not just Daniel's motives, but her own. Was she being naive? Was she letting desperation blind her? But then, something happened that silenced her doubts. One afternoon, Daniel walked into the diner with an envelope. Not money this time, but papers. He slid them across the table. Inside was an acceptance form for Emily to attend one of the top art academies in the state. Full scholarship. All expenses covered. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as tears blurred her vision. "I told you," Daniel said softly. "Kindness changes everything." At that moment, Sarah knew this wasn't about pity or control. It was about impact, about the ripple effect of one small decision, a cup of coffee she hadn't charged for, turning into something so much greater. But just as Sarah's life seemed to shift toward hope, the first real obstacle emerged. Someone in town recognized Daniel for who he was. The whispers turned into accusations, the accusations into threats. The media began circling, smelling a scandal. A billionaire meeting secretly with a struggling single mother in a run-down diner. And as the pressure mounted, Sarah realized that her simple act of kindness hadn't just changed her life. It had thrust her into a storm she never saw coming. The diner was busier than usual that morning. Word had spread, faster than Sarah ever thought possible, about the mysterious man who always sat in her booth. At first, it was whispers. Then, camera phones began to appear. Some customers angled them toward Daniel discreetly, others didn't bother to hide it. Sarah felt the weight of every stare as she moved between tables. Her hands shook slightly as she carried a tray of coffee mugs, the voices around her blurring into one cruel chorus. She must be sleeping with him. Why else would a man like that be here? She's playing him for money. Daniel, sitting calmly in his usual spot, seemed unfazed. He sipped his coffee, jotting something into his leather notebook, his posture as collected as ever. But Sarah felt like she was unraveling. The whispers had reached her daughter's school, too. Emily had come home in tears the night before, saying other kids asked if her mom was dating a billionaire. Sarah had held her, whispering reassurances. But deep inside, her chest ached with fear. This wasn't what she wanted for Emily. By mid-morning, the diner door swung open and the whispers stopped cold. A group of men in suits entered, their presence commanding attention. Sarah's stomach dropped as she recognized them from online photos she had seen during late-night searches. Daniel's corporate board members, powerful men who ran his empire alongside him. They didn't sit. Instead, one of them marched straight to Daniel's booth. "Mr. Ashford," the man said firmly, his voice loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "This is unacceptable." The room froze. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Daniel, still calm, set down his coffee cup and looked up. "Good morning, Harold." "Good morning," the man scoffed. "Do you have any idea what the press is saying? You're jeopardizing the company, your reputation. For this," he gestured sharply towards Sarah. Heat rushed to her face, her body trembling. Every pair of eyes turned to her, dissecting her existence, weighing her worth. The words hit her like stones. For this. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Lower your voice," he said, but Harold wasn't finished. "You disappear from board meetings, spend your mornings in a diner like some ordinary man, and then we discover this? A waitress? Do you realize how this looks?" Sarah wanted to sink into the floor. Her chest burned with humiliation. She didn't ask for this. She didn't chase him. All she had done was cover a cup of coffee, and now her life felt like it was being stripped bare in front of everyone. The customers leaned in, hungry for the drama, the gossip spreading in real time. "Don't do this here," Daniel warned, his voice low, but his composure beginning to crack. "Oh, I think this is exactly where it should happen," Harold snapped. "Maybe then you'll see how ridiculous this is." He turned towards Sarah, his tone dripping with disdain. "Whatever game you're playing, miss. It ends now. You don't belong in his world, and you never will." The words cut deeper than Sarah expected. She had heard versions of them her whole life. Too poor, too plain, too ordinary. But hearing them spoken in front of Daniel, in front of a crowd, made her chest constrict until she could barely breathe. For a moment, she considered running, grabbing her apron, fleeing through the back door, disappearing before the stares and whispers consumed her completely. But before she could move, Daniel stood. The air shifted instantly. His quiet presence exploded into authority, his voice sharp and commanding in a way Sarah had never heard before. "Enough." The word silenced the room. Even Harold stumbled, caught off guard by the steel in Daniel's tone. "You want to talk about reputation?" Daniel continued, his voice carrying through the diner. "Then let's talk, because mine is built on the truth. And the truth is, this woman showed me more humanity in 5 minutes than most of the people in my boardroom have in their entire careers." The crowd murmured, the tension electric. Harold's face flushed, but Daniel pressed on. "Yes, I am Daniel Ashford," he said, his voice ringing out. "Yes, I have more money than I could ever spend. But do you know what all that wealth has bought me? Isolation, distrust, a life where every gesture comes with strings attached. Until her. His gaze shifted to Sarah, softening for the first time, and the world seemed to blur around her. She didn't know my name. She didn't know my worth. All she knew was that I looked like a man who needed help. And she didn't hesitate. That is why I am here. That is why she matters. The diner was silent, the weight of his words settling over every soul in the room. Sarah felt her throat tighten, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Harold tried to recover, his voice shaky but defiant. You're making a mistake. This will ruin you. No, Daniel replied coldly. What ruins a man is forgetting what really matters. With that, he reached into his coat and pulled out another envelope, placing it on the table in front of Sarah. This isn't charity, he said, his voice steady. It's recognition. For your daughter's future. For yours. And if anyone here thinks less of that, it says more about them than it does about you.